everyone, welcome back to Zilog and Moto. As always, we're here to talk about 8 and 16-bit Sega games, and nothing but 8 and 16-bit Sega games. Well, unless we're talking about the original arcade games that these games were based on. Or the 32X, but let's be honest, that doesn't count. Having said all that, in this week's video, even taking into consideration the original arcade game, we're still solidly 8 and 16-bit territory. And that game would be Thunderblade for the Sega Master System. Thunderblade originated from an arcade machine of the same title running on Sega's X-Board platform, which was part of Sega's Super Scalar series of arcade boards. Other titles that appeared on the X-Board platform were Afterburner 1 and 2 and Super Monaco GP, just to name a few. Previously on Zilog and Moto, we looked at another helicopter-based arcade title that made its way to the Master System in Choplifter, which reviewed pretty well, getting 4 stars in episode 47. Choplifter was a fantastic port from the arcades, and while it certainly wasn't perfect and did have a few changes, it was refreshingly close to the original. However, there's a huge difference between Choplifter and Thunderblade, and it's more than just the fact that Thunderblade came out a little over 2 years later. Rather than the X-Board platform, which debuted in 1987 along with Thunderblade, Choplifter ran on the System 2 platform from 1985, which in and of itself was really just a slightly upgraded System 1 board, which had its origins back in 1983. You can probably see where I'm going with this, but to put it simply, the X-Board platform was a magnitude of order more powerful than the System 2. So, while porting a game designed for the System 2 to the Master System, which both were Zilog Z80 based coincidentally, didn't require cutting too many corners, trying to translate a game designed for the much more advanced X-Board platform is another story entirely. What was it about the arcade version that was going to cause so much of a problem for the Master System? And honestly later on for the Genesis for that matter. Well, I mentioned the X-Board being part of Sega's Super Scalar series earlier, and the Super Scalar line of arcade boards had specific hardware to allow for scaling and rotation of sprites. Later on, this functionality would be part of the Sega CD and the Super Nintendo, i.e. Mode 7 on the Super NES. But both the Master System and Genesis lacked the extra hardware to pull this off. Sega, undeterred, decided to prepare a port of Thunderblade to the underpowered Master System to capitalize on name recognition of the arcade title, and not quite a year later, in October of 1988, Thunderblade was released for the Master System in the United States, while its sequel in name only, Super Thunderblade, was released as a launch title for the Mega Drive in Japan that same month. It's almost as if Sega knew the Master System couldn't properly handle the game, but still needed to release something for the console to help it limp along in the United States until the Genesis was released in 1989. So, what were the results of Sega's attempt to release a version of Thunderblade on the Master System? Did they strike gold and release a hidden gem that captures the action of the original on a scaled-down platform? Or did they release a pitiful excuse of a shooter that only resembles the original in name only? Well, you can probably guess the answer based on the last few paragraphs, but we'll get to that shortly. In the meantime, let's take a look at the physical package. Thunderblade. You know, one good thing I can say about this game is that coming out in late 1988, Sega had finally figured out that their American covers sucked, for lack of a better term, and we started to get some improved art that actually looked interesting. And the logo from the arcade version to boot. I've heard that this game was influenced by the film Blue Thunder, and I'm not sure about that necessarily, but I do find it interesting that the helicopter in the art is a nice shade of blue. And just for comparison's sake, I'll insert the Japanese cover. And I've got to say, for the first time, I think I prefer the American-European cover to the Japanese version on a Master System title. What difference a few years makes. This particular copy of Thunderblade is in great shape, with the clamshell being fully intact, including the hang tab, for once, and no damage or rips. And the internal cover is in really good shape as well, with a tiny bit of wrinkling on the back. I'm not even sure if you can maybe kind of see it in the light here, but you got to be looking at it extremely closely to tell that.
speaking of the back cover, the back cover has a slightly newer format for the Master System titles, with 4 good quality screenshots on the left and the flavor text on the right, and down below 2 information boxes about the game. I'm not sure why they didn't just include the level information here with everything else and just have one big box, but I guess they decided it looked better that way. However, it is nice and organized, and I like how it's outlined in yellow. Of the 4 screenshots, 3 are from the overhead vertical sequences in the game, and 1 is from the third-person 3D view, and all of them look colorful and interesting. We'll talk more about the 3D sequences later, but some of them don't look so great, so this cave sequence from the second level is actually a good choice to mask that a bit. And if you can't tell what I'm talking about, this one here is what the 3D sequences look like. Actually, I'll zoom in on that real quick. Okay. Opening up the game, and you'll see an interesting sight. The cartridge, obviously, looks really good. But the interesting portion is this, where I've got not 1, not 2, but 3 copies of the manual. I'd totally forgotten about this when I went to play the game, so I was definitely a bit surprised to see this when I opened up the case earlier this week. I'm not exactly sure what happened here, but I think a while back I'd bought a lot of Master System manuals off of eBay in case I found the games without the manuals. Well, I never really followed up on that, but I guess that's where these extra 2 manuals came from. I'll have to make a point of throwing them back up on eBay after this review, or else I'm sure I'll forget about it for another 20 years or so. There's not too much to this manual. You can see it's relatively thin, only 14 pages, including the cover. But that's to be expected considering the fact this game isn't terribly deep. And there's not a ton to explain here. I do like how all the enemies, I'll get to that, all the enemies have specific pictures and drawings, including the bosses. Of course, except for the last boss. Got to keep that one secret. And there's also a nice bit in here. Let's see, where is that? About how you can continue if at the end of the game. Let's see if I can find that. Yes, right here under helpful hints at the very end. This is very helpful. Continue mode. When the game over sign appears, push the D button down and to the right and push button 2 at the same time. Very, very handy to have that. Although Sega could have just made it obvious. I don't know why they didn't just do that. It would have been a lot simpler with just a regular continue button. And finally the, oh, I should have left that open. Finally the traditional Master System high score sheet at the end. Okay, that's Thunderblade plus a few extra manuals. Now let's get to the actual game and see what Sega was able to pack into the 2 huge megabits here.
So let's get right into it and talk about Thunderblade. The original arcade version of Thunderblade is a shooter where you control a helicopter armed with a gun and rockets, where your goal is to move through 4 levels fighting off enemy helicopters, tanks, and planes before taking on a giant mobile command center, i.e. boss, at the end of each level. Each of the 4 levels is split into 3 sections, with each level starting out with an overhead mode, where you're taking out land-based enemies, and the game uses scaling to give a 3D feel showcasing the distance between you and the enemies on the ground. The second section of each level shifts to a third-person view behind your helicopter, and you engage air-based enemies and land-based enemies, while again heavily using scaling to animate enemies in the backgrounds to add 3D depth and the effect of things getting larger as you get close to them. Finally, the third and final section of each level switches back to the overhead view as you face down the boss of the level while flying over top and shooting down at anything that moves. The Master System version of Thunderblade mirrors that same design. While the gameplay is a bit different, at least the actual level structure is the same. And you may have noticed that when we look at the back of the case, in one of the inset boxes, it specifically says 4 stages, 12 rounds, referencing the 4-level structure with 3 parts per level. So at very least, you can say that Sega got this part right. However, things start to fall apart quickly after that. One of the things that makes helicopters special and separates them from airplanes in regards to air combat is the fact that helicopters can hover in place. They don't always have to be moving forward to stay in the air, and if need be, they can slow down, stop, and even move backwards if need be, to better attack or evade a situation. The arcade game takes that into consideration and has a throttle, which governs how fast your helicopter moves through the levels. Need to slow down and take a more careful tact, or need to speed up and blow through a section quickly to avoid attack? Just move the throttle forwards or back. If you're familiar with Afterburner or Star Wars Arcade, the handheld throttle lever works in the same manner. The Master System version completely removes this function from the game. Depending on the section of the game, your helicopter is always either moving forward towards the top of the screen at a common rate of speed, a la standard vertical shooter, or moving forward at a common rate of speed in the third-person view 3D levels. It's not a big loss from the game, but it does remove some of what made the arcade version special, and a reason to play it instead of any other shooter. The second major change from the arcade version is how the arcade version handles the overhead sections. As mentioned in the arcade version, when you're playing through the beginning of each level and at the end during the boss fights, your helicopter's up in the air, and very clearly firing down at targets that are on the ground, either tanks or enemy helicopters that haven't launched into the air yet. And the game uses scaling to make the enemies on the ground seem far away, except for when you miss a helicopter and it launches in the air towards you. Since the Master System has no capability for scaling, the overhead section of the game has been flattened, so to speak, and now air-based attackers have been added to the levels. There's still a minor 3D effect, as even though the levels have been flattened, there are still 2 planes for enemies to appear on. They can either appear in the air, in which case your helicopter can attack with its forward-mounted gun, or they can appear on the ground, in which case rockets must be launched to get down to the surface. Essentially, it turns these sections into just a standard vertical shooter, like a 1941 or Raid. However, there's one catch: the aspect ratio. Vertical shooters traditionally are viewed in portrait resolution, rather than landscape resolution, meaning that they're taller than they are long. This is important because it gives the player more time to react to oncoming enemies and projectiles, which can be crucial depending on what's happening on the screen. Thunderblade instead retains its landscape resolution from the arcades. This worked in the arcades due to the fact that you were shooting down at enemies on the ground rather than having to worry about enemies flying right at you, and because you could control your rate of movement and slow down if need be. The Master System version is still playable, mind you, but it's definitely not as enjoyable as it could be due to this, and there's really a good chance you'll probably have a cheap death or two from not quite being able to avoid contact with something. The middle sections of each level, aka the third-person view sections from behind the helicopter, hold up relatively well considering. The graphics are much simpler than what's found in the arcade in these sections, as you would expect, but the gameplay hasn't been changed nearly as much. You're still flying towards the eventual boss at the end of the level, and while flying, must avoid fire from flying and land-based enemies, and avoid flying into columns and parts of buildings that might be in your way. One oddity about these levels, however, and I believe it's related to how the game handles its version of scaling, is that the trajectory of ordnance from the enemies appears to curve rather than fly on a straight line. Like the issue with the overhead sequences being in landscape resolution rather than portrait to provide you less reaction time, it doesn't totally break the game, but it definitely alters it in a way to make the game more difficult. As you can tell from the previous few paragraphs, the Master System version of Thunderblade has definitely been compromised in its port over from the arcade. But even the changes to the core gameplay don't specifically ruin the game. However, what does ruin the game is your ability to fire the guns on your helicopter, or lack thereof. The Master System controller has 2 buttons, and in this case, one is dedicated to shooting rockets at ground foes, and the other is for shooting the front-mounted cannon. You can only shoot 1 rocket at a time, meaning that if there's a rocket on the screen, you have to wait for it to either blow up its target or fly off the screen before firing another one. This I don't mind too much, as you'll be using your front-mounted cannon far more. What I do mind is how that cannon works. There's no rapid-fire option, meaning that you have to press a button for every single shot. However, even when simply mashing the button, it appears you can only have 4 shots on screen at once, which is a disaster for waves of more than 4 enemies coming at you. Switching to a rapid-fire mode on my controller makes shooting more tolerable, but trying to play the game with a normal controller, and with all the other previously discussed compromises, it's pretty dreadful. I could deal with all the other changes and be understanding of the fact that the Master System is just simply overmatched from a hardware perspective to make a proper port, but objectively poor offensive gameplay in a shooter is the straw that broke the camel's back for me. Looking past these flaws, the in-game graphics are mediocre and low-detailed. While I didn't notice any slowdown or flicker when playing the game, I think the lack of detail is probably the reason for that. The overhead sequences probably fare the best in that regard, and the backgrounds resemble other vertical shooters that I've seen, even though they can look pretty rough at times, with the ground in the first part of level 2 camouflaging enemy helicopters, making it hard to determine if you're going to run into them or not. The middle 3D sections are much worse, with buildings on the side of the road consisting of giant gray rectangles, or blotchy pillars and caves that made me wonder if I was playing the game on a Commodore 64. And yes, I know they're both 8-bit machines, but anyone that's played games on a Commodore 64 would understand. Fields are ugly yellow and green stripes, and trees in the third level have graphical errors where they're cut off due to being pasted on top of one another. The in-game sound isn't anything to write home about either. Essentially, there's one song for the entire time you play the game. And it's okay, but only having one mediocre song in the entire game is pretty lame. Interestingly enough, this is one of the Master System games with an alternate FM soundtrack. However, that requires an aftermarket power base converter and not the official one from Sega. And unfortunately, I still haven't bought one of those. But in this case, it didn't matter. I watched a playthrough of the game from a user who had the FM sound available, and it didn't really sound any better. And honestly, I think it sounded worse. Still only one song the entire game, and most of the time it's muffled by explosions anyway. I will say enemy fire sounds distinctly better, but one sound effect certainly isn't worth anyone's time to try to seek us out. All in all, I'm giving Thunderblade 2 out of 5. It's not a total disaster, but it's got some pretty massive flaws, and even grading on a 1988 curve, it doesn't look or sound great, and the gameplay has some moments that are massively unfair, i.e. good luck avoiding fire from the planes that come strafing at you starting the second section of level 2. Thankfully, Sega at least had the good sense to include 2 continues, and that's part of why this is a 2-star game rather than a single star. But even that implementation is goofy, as there are going to be plenty of times that you're frustrated with dying and just instinctively hit the fire button rather than hold down the right to continue. It would have been much easier to just have a standard continue option, but I guess that's just a microcosm of the whole game. Even with the limited hardware at Sega's disposal, the game could have been so much better had they just been smarter about the design. However, I'm hopeful that in 100 episodes or so, when we get to the Super Thunderblade on the Genesis, that the extra few months in development allowed them to put out a better game.
Okay, and that was Thunderblade for the Master System. Really, just skip this one unless you absolutely have to play every shooter out there or love helicopter games for some reason. Fun fact, I mentioned earlier how supposedly this game was influenced by the film Blue Thunder, but the movie also begat a short-lived television show that competed against Airwolf, another helicopter-based television show. But the Blue Thunder TV show featured Chicago Bears legend Dick Butkus, Bubba Smith, aka Hightower from Police Academy, and pre-Saturday Night Live Dana Carvey? Yes, this is a thing that actually exists, and while I didn't see it listed on any streaming services, when I was doing research for this episode, there is a DVD set of it out there, believe it or not. So yeah, maybe the best thing to come out of me doing this review is finding out that that's a thing. And I may or may not have ordered a copy of it from Amazon. Tune in next week when we take a look at only the second puzzle game so far on Zilog and Moto. This puzzle game came out for both the Genesis and the Master System, and it may not be the one you're thinking of. Remember, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.